There's been books written on this passage from Mark. I feel very qualified in some ways to even start looking at such a famous passage, which is part of our liturgy week in, week out, to be honest. But I thought it's worth at least starting, hopefully, some thoughts for you to muse on, at least. If you woke up in the middle of the night and you found that your house was on fire and you could grab one thing, what would it be? That's a question I always used to ask my youth group to try and work out about priorities. What would it be? My hunch is most people would say, well, I'd make sure everyone's awake, and if we've got babies, we'd grab hold of them and get them out. The youth group didn't have babies. But it was interesting to hear the different answers. What would your answer be? Would it be your passport? Would it be a particular piece of art? Some photos that have special memories for you? Instruments, musical instrument or something? A camera? Something from a hobby? Your phone? Car keys? Bible? Sermon notes if it's a Saturday night? I don't know. What would you grab hold of? And when you got outside, would you be pleased with the decision that you made as you see everything else burnt to the ground? It's a question to try and work out what our priorities are. And the question asked of Jesus was to try and work out what his priority is as well. To try and distill the myriad of law and commandments into a single priority. It's like when somebody says to you, so what's your favorite verse of the Bible? I mean, the answer really is it's the one that I need at any particular moment, isn't it? Rather than saying, well, it's the only one that I know, it's to try and work out what it is. And so that Jesus was asked to distill the law and the commandments, and he gives this famous answer. And it's the interesting is he says, hear, O Israel, hear. So they're to listen. We too are to listen to the answer. I mean, it's not that he doesn't want us to listen to anything else that he says, but this seems to be important. This is distilling something of his priorities of why he came. Listen. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. To love God is to show something of worth. It is a way of worship. It's not just an hour a week. It's a life of worship that we put that towards God. So often we can see worship as maybe just singing songs, or maybe spending time with God, maybe reading through the Psalms. But there's a variety of ways of worshiping. And in fact, our whole lives should be in itself an act of worship. And so that is the first one which he sees, and is the reason in one ways why we were made, was to reflect back to who God created us, and us worshipping him is where we find our ultimate fulfillment in being a created being made in his image, is to worship him. Everybody worships, It's just that they don't always worship the right thing. In other places, Jesus will say things like, you can't serve two masters. It's about worship. What are you worshipping? You can't love both money and God. He's not saying it's wrong to have money. He's just saying you can't worship both. Where's your priorities? A life of worship. But he adds a second. It's an outworking of what happens. We worship, we feel God's love, and it can easily become, worship can almost like become a God in itself and something that we worship. Matt Redman wrote a song a number of years ago now about the heart of worship, saying, I'm sorry for what I've made it. Because he came to the realization that he was starting to worship the worship rather than worshiping God himself. And that came through a time when the church that he was at, which we were closely associated with, spent a time of just, they banned sung worship to try and get back to the roots of meeting with God. And he found that really difficult as a worship leader. And so as a self-reflective kind of guy, he was saying, why do I find this so difficult? And he came to the realization that that's what he was doing. He was worshiping worship. It's a danger that any church member can do, is that we start to say, well, I only go to a church service of this style because I can worship. That's dangerous. I'm not saying it's not wrong. It's dangerous to say you can only worship in one way, because our whole life should be an act of worship. So at St. Mark's, we have a variety of ways of worshipping, because we want to encourage people to discover all sorts of ways of worshipping and being a community together that worships in different ways. And so there's this life of worship and this outpouring that follows from that. Neighbor as yourself. The second is this: love your neighbor. This gives us a basics for a holistic, balanced life as well. What Jesus says here in these two commandments. Love God, love it. It's what we base the values of St. Mark's on the up, in, and out, that we connect with God. We're here for one another, and we're here for Harrogate and beyond. Up, in, and out. It gives us a balance. It gives us a diagnostic tool, as it were, as where am I strong and where am I weak? Am I doing well? Am I up? Am I doing well? Am I in? Am I doing well? Am I out? Or where am I struggling? It's a quick way of just finding out where you're at in your spiritual walk with Jesus at any particular moment. The up, following Jesus. You'd have seen outside, we've got some new green boards by the bus stop. Have you noticed those? Put your hands up if you noticed those. Hands up if you haven't noticed those. Okay. Those are the people that come in the car or walk in from a different direction. But there's some new green boards by the bus stop. And in there we've got 3 lines which are becoming sort of like a little slogan for us here, which are based around this up, in, and out. Following Jesus, making disciples, building the kingdom. We were musing about whether that should be follow Jesus, make disciples, build the kingdom. But putting it in following, making, building means it's an ongoing concept that we continually want to do, that we continually want to keep on following Jesus. We want to keep on making disciples, and we want to keep on building the kingdom of God. So the following Jesus on the up is a choice of conscience. It's something you choose to do, to put him as a priority and to follow his teaching and to put that teaching into practice. It's not always easy, is it? But it's a conscious decision that we try to do. The only way you'll know if Jesus is Lord is that when he says something and you don't want to do it, you still do what he asks you to do. That's the ultimate costly relationship, when you know that he is your Lord because you've chosen to do what he wants you to do rather than what you want to do. In some ways, it's the only way you'll know that you're truly following him is when you have that tough decision to make and you decide to go with what Jesus is asking you to do rather than what you would prefer to do. It's costly being a follower of Jesus. Sorry, I keep having these little things that fly through my mind of what I could add, and I'm thinking, no, I haven't got time. Keep going. And I'm just letting them fly on, which you might probably most grateful for. So that's the up. The out, building the kingdom. Building the kingdom. That's very jargony. I'm aware of that. But what it means in essence is what Jesus says in the Lord's Prayer. Making earth more like heaven. Allowing us to dream the dream. Let it be on earth as it is in heaven. And to work towards that. The kingdom is wherever the king rules. Is he ruling in your life? And where do we want him to see his rule roll out? And so by building the kingdom is to encourage a way where Jesus can be and his teaching is manifestly worked through and out. And then finally, the in is making disciples. And the bottom line is that starts with ourselves. We can't start making disciples until we've consciously made a decision to be a disciple ourselves in how we follow Jesus and how we try to be more like our Rabbi Jesus. That's what disciples are. That's their key role in their existence, is to become like their rabbis and to consciously make that decision. So that starts with ourselves. And then as that starts with ourselves, sometimes people will ask us to help them. Or we see somebody and we just feel a prompting from God that maybe we can help them and we can then help others to become disciples as well. So following Jesus, making disciples, building the kingdom. That balance of life which Jesus is saying here, I think is really helpful for us to keep our heart on and our minds on and to work on with all our strength. I think it's one for us to muse on over this week as we think about this passage during the week, maybe in your small groups. My final thought is this: what would the world look like if we did what Jesus prioritizes here? What would the Middle East look like? What would the Western world look like? What would Russia, Ukraine look like if the priorities of Jesus were across the whole world? It's why building the kingdom and Jesus' rule is so imperative. Not to build ourselves up, not to make ourselves important, but the world needs Jesus and his teaching. That's why we share it, not because we want to prove ourselves to be right. That's the last reason to do it. But the world desperately needs to know Jesus and his teaching. And so we continue to follow his priorities by following him, making disciples as he asked in Matthew 28, and building up the kingdom of God so that the world becomes more like heaven as he asks us in the Lord's Prayer. Let's have a moment's silence and allow God to work in our hearts and minds